Hello and welcome to the 49th episode of the Hope Illuminated podcast, your source for the stories, science, and strategy of resilience, mental health promotion, and suicide prevention, where we live, learn, and work. I'm your host, Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas, and I'm on a life mission to empower communities with solutions that help people overcome isolation and despair and rekindle a passion for living. Each episode, we're joined by international experts who help inspire hope and offer real guidance. Welcome to the show. I'm so glad that you've joined us.
Thank
Today,
you.
yes, all of you. Today's conversation is going to be super exciting. I know it's something that's really a burning topic for a lot of people. I get asked these questions all the time when I speak, especially to community members. Their concerns about social media and the internet and all these things that are happening out there that are maybe hard to understand if it's good or bad. Today, we're going to talk about how they can be forces for good. And so I just want to kind of tee up the conversation a little bit because this is a very hot topic. We know that Google, for example, has partnered with a National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So when people are searching terms that are connected to suicide, automatically it pops up that you'll get a window that says, do you need some support? Here's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So already we know that search engine optimization, search terms, we can connect people who might be searching for how-to resources quickly. Our guest is going to talk way more about that and all the things she's learned. Facebook has also been partnering with our crisis resources they used to call it a report function when somebody was posting things that were concerning. Now we call it more of a support function where you can go in and get connected to folks that can really help you figure out how to respond to someone in your Facebook community that may be posting things that are concerning. So that's also really exciting. And this whole world of artificial intelligence is really helping us figure out some patterns in public posting that may be indicative and predictive of suicidal thoughts or future suicide behavior. So this whole world of SEO and social media is actually giving us a lot of opportunities to do some really good work. Tragically, it can also, we also get indications when things are not going well. I'm sure many of you are aware of the research that came out over the summer on 13 Reasons Why, where within just a couple of months, we had Google Analytics of a huge uptick in people searching for, teens searching for suicide content. The phrase teen suicide increased by 34% in the months after the show released. And then that in itself is not as concerning because maybe they were searching for solutions or resources. But the terms how to commit suicide also increased about 26% during that time frame. So SEO and our analytics can really help us. I also identify trends that are concerning. So in this conversation, we are going to be talking about harnessing these tools and technologies for the power of good. And in her description of our talk today, she talks about these things are about connection and technology is the tool. Our guest, Ann Moss Rogers, did lose her son, Charles, to suicide and has really become a passionate and dedicated champion for suicide prevention. And she leverages her professional tools as a digital marketing expert to dedicate a deeper understanding of how social media and SEO can be used to reach people who are actively in despair and searching for ways to kill themselves. And her work has really given her some really remarkable and unexpected results. So yes, she's a suicide loss survivor like myself. Her precious son died June 5th, 2015 after a long battle with depression and addiction that she'll talk about her journey into this work as we talk today. She brands herself as an emotionally naked speaker, which is a very bold brand, I must say, but it's very provocative and I think is really true to who she is. She just recently launched a book, which I'll be dropping into the show notes, Diary of a Broken Mind. She's also a storyteller through TEDx. She's a brain tumor survivor. Her blog has got unimaginable followership and hits based on her strategy on reaching people. And she's just a delight. We met, we crossed paths a couple of months ago, but met in person at the National Speakers Association annual conference that was here in Denver. Very cool. And we became fast friends. We were buddies throughout the thing. And I think awesome dance partners late night. So really excited to have you on my show, and welcome to the show. So glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, Sally. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, let's dive in. Tell us about your journey, and tragically, like many of us, it starts in a very, very, very sad and tragic place. But bring us along on how you got to this space to be this expert in this very important niche of suicide prevention. Where did it start for you?
Well, it actually started years before my son died by suicide, and I wasn't as focused on suicide. I was focused more on mental health. And I noticed that, as we were struggling through all that is considered mental health, I was having a difficult time navigating it. So I joined a foundation, and that was back in 2010. And 5 years later, my son died by suicide. And I was so shocked because all that body of work I had done in the 5 years previously on mental illness, I had been to one suicide prevention workshop that was like an hour. And I remember back then that people wanted to have more, but the subject was so closed, even more than it is today. And I still didn't feel like any of it pertained to my son or my life. And so what happened was my son was the funniest, most popular kid in school. And it's around 2010 that he started to struggle. And what happened is he developed depression, and drugs and alcohol became his antidote. But I didn't know that at the time. And what I had a difficult time getting was a diagnosis. I kept going to professionals. I kept saying, I need a diagnosis. And they said, well, we need to do such and such testing. And of course, it wasn't testing that was covered under insurance or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I ended up paying a lot of money for them to tell me my son was high risk. And they never defined what high risk meant.
Yeah.
Does that mean that...
Such a frustration in our system.
Yes.
If mental health professionals have been trained at all, they've only been trained in trying to figure out risk. And we now know that humans' ability to actually identify risk is really bad, like from a predictive sense. We're terrible at predicting who's at imminent risk, but that's the only thing that we've been taught to do. Not very much has been taught to mental health professionals on what actually to do to help people, to help families navigate this very frightening space. So your story, unfortunately, is all too common, where it's mental health professionals in their fear just throwing endless screening tools and endless assessments and really not carving out a pathway on what to do to get through it, to make it better, to alleviate that misery. So I'm so sorry you had that experience. I apologize on behalf of my field that we can so much do better. I also want to just acknowledge your pathway of being invested and curious about mental health and really how to help your son before the tragedy hit, and really not finding adequate resources or training or anything related to suicide prevention. Now, that was almost a decade ago. We've gotten a little bit better since then, but it's still hard when families are in the midst of trying to find answers and they don't get suicide specific information because it's closed off or people are afraid. You don't lead people to answers or guide them on how to ask questions that can open up a conversation. So then what happened?
Well, you're exactly right, because that was exactly my experience. So his drug use started to escalate because he was coping with thoughts of suicide. And Sally, I didn't know that either. I mean, I had no idea that the funniest, most popular kid in school, this bubbly, he was the spark that lit the flame of fun. And to think that he suffered from depression just wasn't on my radar. And it was actually a teacher that introduced me to the possibility that my son might be depressed.
Interesting.
Now, he denied it, but his drug use got to the point that we had to have him kidnapped out of his bed and taken to a wilderness program. So I had to make the choice to introduce a horrific trauma in my sensitive son's life. And that was to save his life. And looking back, Sally, I still don't know, was that the right thing to do? But I really don't think he was going to live much more than 6 months.
Yeah. It's so easy, especially when you've lost someone, to look in that rearview mirror with the tyranny of hindsight and do all the woulda, coulda, shouldas. I mean, it sounded like you were in a very desperate space, watching your son deteriorate so quickly, and sometimes drastic measures can be a turning point. It's just hard to know, and that kidnapping him out of their bed sounds very, very intense for all of you. I can't even imagine what that was like for your family.
Yeah, you have to sign away parental rights in
Oh my
order to
God.
do it. And and the look on his face when he was escorted out, I burned just a hole in my heart. So he goes to Wilderness, and guess what they do? They do a psychological evaluation. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I can't believe I had to pay $32,000 for this. I
Again.
find, again, and I find out later that that would have been a $50 copay had I just gone in and said, I want a psychological evaluation. I didn't know that term.
Mm.
So he was diagnosed with depression and anxiety, cannabis dependence, because he was using it as medication, giving me the spiel that it was all natural.
Hmm.
And he was diagnosed with ADHD combined type. And we already knew about his sleep disorder. So he had a sleep disorder called delayed sleep phase syndrome. And what that meant is that he wasn't able to fall asleep until late at night. And as they get older, that time advances. So in elementary school, he would fall asleep around 11 o'clock. But by high school, it had advanced to where he couldn't sleep until 2 a.m.
Oh, wow, brutal.
Right. So that elevated his use of drugs and alcohol to kind of help it along. Meanwhile, we're going to doctors and they're presenting solutions that an emotionally immature person really can't follow, like this light schedule. And it just, he wasn't going to be able to execute that. And I was supposed to do it alongside him. And I mean, I was like, I'm not sure if I can do this.
Mm.
So he really wasn't willing. And at one point, we relied on medication because it had been years. And we were like, what do we do? And a doctor suggested, well, have you thought about, kind of jump starting it with a sleeping pill? And it would just got tangled, and he mixed it with alcohol, which caused more problems. So anyway, he goes from Wilderness to therapeutic boarding school. And he comes home in 2014, having spent about 22 months outside our home in some kind of placement.
Mm.
And he ends up going back to coping with his problems with drugs and alcohol, because guess what, Sally? Nothing had changed, you
And,
know.
and and let's be honest, people turn to drugs and alcohol not because they're bad people, but because those things work. If you can't find anything that works to take away your pain, you drink enough, you're going to pass out. You can numb yourself, in the short run. In the long run, it doesn't work out so well for you. But if you're desperate for sleep, if you're desperate in your misery, it makes sense why people turn to those things. And especially if your brain is wired to get a really strong response from it, it can act quickly and solve that problem for you in that moment. So it's understandable
Yeah.
why he came home, and I'm guessing maybe neither of you had a really robust follow-up plan on how to support his
No.
recovery. No, this is another huge gap in our chain of survival, is that, you know, we do these intensive quote unquote treatments. I don't always know that they're helpful. In many cases, they're traumatizing. And then we kick the person back to their family and business as usual and say, you know, good luck. And that's another place where people are really falling through the cracks. So I'm so sorry again that the mental health system, you know, failed your family in this way. And that, you know, here you had invested, you know, this time and this money with great hopes that maybe he would find another pathway, and it was insufficient for him.
It was. And he, in those moments of suicidal thought, I can understand, as you have just pointed out, that my son thought, okay, drugs are bad, but it's worse to kill myself. And if this keeps me from killing myself, isn't that okay?
Mm.
And then he met heroin, and
Mm.
heroin made him feel like a king. At first, of course. And then it didn't. And then he's addicted. So he ends up confessing to us. He goes to detox, he goes to rehab, he goes to a recovery house. And at this recovery house, he relapses within 24 hours because my son just wasn't ready yet. He wasn't ready for recovery. We were ready for recovery. And, you know, we couldn't do it for him. So he is taken back to detox, and he walks out with a friend. And for 2 weeks, we didn't know where he was. And I'm sitting in the back of a police car in a parking lot when the officer says, your son has been found dead this morning. Sally, I am certain at that moment that they're going to tell me he died of overdose. And when my husband asked, how did he die? And they said suicide, it was like this extra twist of a knife.
Yeah.
And my first thought was, how could I be such a crummy mother that my child would check out on me? And it would be a really long time before I would understand that it wasn't my fault and that I can't control another human being. And that wasn't lack of love, but that my son was experiencing intense pain. He thought he was a burden. And you hear that word burden often when people are talking about thoughts of suicide. They're thinking that my family would be better off if they didn't have to struggle with all this. And that's when I decided that I needed to go forward with this topic, my community, but I was terrified. You know, the first thing I did is I wrote a newspaper article, and I thought, oh my gosh, nobody will ever read it. And that's going to make me feel like I'm burying my child again. And finally, I just kind of slapped myself and like, get over it. You said you were going public. That doesn't mean second guessing yourself. You've got to share that article. And I did. And I went home and I shared it with my family and friends, and I closed my computer and I went down to the river and took my dog, and I said, for 24 hours, I am not looking at my computer or my phone or anything. And the next day I woke up and it had gone viral. You know, Sally, other people were reading their story and mine. That's why it went viral. It's not because it was brilliantly written. It was because it was emotionally naked. And I told
And
the
no one,
story.
this was 2016-ish? What time frame is this?
2016, early in
Yeah.
2016.
So this is really the beginning of the surge and the crest of the nation becoming aware of the opiate crisis, and no one is really connecting the dots at that point in a
Right.
very intentional way between that crisis and suicide. And so I also think your emotionally naked description of your journey really resonated with a lot of people and their fears and their wondering, and so I'm so grateful that you opened that door to to exploring that connection and a parent's agony through it, to give people a sense of that they weren't alone and that there was a community of people out there feeling and thinking the same thing you were in those really dark dark nights.
And you know what? That's what energized me. That's what told me to keep moving forward with it. All the thousands and thousands of comments, which are no longer there, unfortunately, because the article's been moved a couple of times. And I'm so sorry I didn't screenshot those comments.
Mm-hmm.
They meant so much to me because I was connecting with other people who had suffered from addiction and thought and felt the same things I had. And then all of a sudden, because that article, I had started a blog about a month before it actually published, because you'll send an article to the newspaper and you don't always know when it's going to publish. So it only published probably 2-3 months after I wrote it. And I had started a blog. So all of a sudden, I have this huge audience on this new little
Wow.
blog, to the point that I had to immediately get the next web hosting package because it couldn't handle all the traffic.
Crashing. And it's the Emotionally Naked blog. Is that correct?
It's the Emotionally Naked
Yeah. I
blog.
just want to make sure people can find it because there's lots of good stuff there. So yeah. So then what happened?
And I started writing my way through grief. And so I'm approaching my son's first birthday after his death. And this is the first one I'm facing since the suicide. And I'm struggling. I'm struggling a lot. So I write this post called The Final 48 Hours. And I give a blow by blow description of being in the back of that police car and everything I felt of getting the news when my son's suicide. And when I wrote it, I thought, why on earth did I write this and put it out there? All this ugly, naked mama grief. So I published it, but I didn't share it. But at this point, I had subscribers and they shared it. And all of a sudden, 60,000 people had read it like in the first 24 hours. And I thought, what is it about this article that people would actually want to read? And why did I write it? And 2 days later, I get a message from a young lady who's 22 years old, and it says, 2 days ago, I thought about taking my life. Reading a post from a mother who's felt such devastating pain has changed my perspective on life. And I thought, that's why I wrote it.
That's why. Yeah. Yep. I do believe while it's hard for suicide attempt survivors and people living with suicide intensity sometimes to connect to the power of our suicide bereavement grief, because they're trying to escape pain. They don't want to inflict pain. Often they want people to just be relieved that they're gone. I do believe there's power in our connecting in these worlds and having these kinds of conversations, as hard as they are. So I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful you found the courage to be so emotionally naked. What did you call it? Ugly mama grief. I mean, that is,
Ugly mama grief, yeah.
yeah, that's brutal grief. And
And I didn't write it for the purpose of reaching these people or to tell them, look what you've done. And
no,
that
no.
wasn't it at all, because
Well, and
most
that
of
would
the
be
audience,
right. That would be felt by that audience as you're just trying to manipulate me.
exactly,
You were authentic in your voice, and people found it because of the incredible connectivity that your audience has, and it reached people who heard that authentic voice, and it touched them.
exactly. Like if somebody comes to me and they say, I'm thinking of suicide, I would never go on with my grief story. I mean, it's not about me at that point. It's about me listening to them.
That's right.
But that's how it happened on this day. And that gave me this, you know what? There is something to this. And it was not long after that that I had to send a death certificate somewhere. And there was a tiny line at the bottom that talked about my son's instrument of death. And I thought, how did he know to fashion that? I mean, the kid was smart, but he was no engineer. It was more creative smart.
Mm-hmm.
And I I couldn't figure it out, and then all of a sudden it hit me. He Googled how to make that. You know, people how to Google how to install a faucet, right? I figured out that people in that moment of distress are Googling ways to die.
Yep.
And I vowed that I was going to be on the first page of Google. So I Googled that phrase myself. And the suicide hotline showed up at the top, but also a lot of videos that gave some very specific instructions on this way to die.
Wow.
It was so intense and so detailed that I really felt sick. And I thought, I can't look at this anymore. But that really fueled my passion to get on that first page. So my first attempts at kind of writing that specific article, the first one I wrote was too general. And then I wrote one with the exact phrase that I thought my son used. And then I had to figure out, well, what goes on the page other than the suicide hotlines?
And I just
And
want
then
to
I got,
intersect here so the listeners know Ann Moss is not coming to this conversation blindly. She has a whole career of, marketing and digital technology and all of these things. So she's bridging, this passion that she has now with this incredible knowledge of these digital tools. Can you just speak for a second about kind of what you brought to the table for this moment so people can really appreciate why you chose this particular, I'm going to say provocative angle to the work, because you knew how to navigate this space, and you knew that you would have a far greater likelihood of connecting to people in their most despairing hour.
that's true. I used to get leads for, say, plumbers online, and I owned a digital marketing firm. So I had decades of experience with regular marketing like TV, radio, print. But in 1995, I had moved into digital marketing. And I knew how to write for an audience, and I knew that I should put the headline as what I thought people searched. So these days, I'll go to a high school and they'll say, how do I help a friend who's cutting? Guess what I do? I come home and go, I'm going to write an article on that, because if they're asking me, there are people Googling that phrase. And now that's the number 2 article on my site that young people look at from the internet. And I noticed that people in companies will look up ways to die or ways to help or ways to tell somebody. They'll look up all sorts of things. How can I be the resource that helps people with specific instructions on, I've got one up there that says, my son just told me he wants to die. What do I do now? Because as a parent, what you want to do is every time they walk in the door, go, oh, you okay? Are you okay? And just call them constantly.
Right.
Well, that's not going to do it. You need to kind of use some self-care and get some, wrap some education around it. So at any rate, I also needed to know what was the right thing to put on this page. So I put the suicide hotlines, but I didn't put a lot else, because I didn't feel trained to do that. So I took a Safe Talk class and I took an Assist class. And then I would go to Out of the Darkness Walk and I would speak to those who had lived experience.
And could you just for a moment, for the listeners who are not familiar with those trainings, describe to them what they gave to you and how you can access them?
Okay, Safe Talk is suicide alertness for everyone. And it's a 4-hour course that anyone in any industry can take. And that was the first course that I took. And I'm actually now a Safe Talk trainer, because a lot of people have 4 hours and are willing to do that for this topic. Companies, individuals, and then Assist training is kind of the gold standard. And that's 2 days, and it is very intense with a lot of role play. And you learn actually how to intervene and what to do when an individual is suicidal.
And just to comment, these trainings offered by Living Works are really accessible. There are trainers everywhere, really most of the world you can find a trainer. And I just learned that Living Works has now an online course that you can take, at least to get you started. So
Right.
there's accessibility all over if you want to improve your knowledge and skills around this topic. I'll just throw out the others. QPR is another one, question, persuade,
Mhm.
refer. They have an in-person or an online version for workplaces. Working Minds is a 2-hour training. So there's lots of different options, both in person and online, that you can access to get more information about how to help in your community. And then what's the Out of Darkness Walk?
Um, so the Out of the Darkness Walk is through American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, and those are all over the United States, and there are some in other countries as well, like Canada, Australia, and the UK. And so I did a lot of those walks. I also connected with Dr. Lisa Horowitz at the National Institute of Mental Health. And she and I give a presentation on something called the Ask Suicide Screening Tool, which is a 4-question, it's just, it's a screening. It does nothing but, should I go to the assessment phase for this particular individual? So I needed to kind of let all that marinate to connect the dots. So I had to take the marketing piece that I had known how to do, plus the research and the research I was seeing that was coming in from people. And then somebody sent me an email, and I got another one said, this video of your son saved my life last night. And I said, so I'll put that video on the page.
What was this video?
And it's just a video of him singing, doing a rap called Letter to God. And I will open a lot of presentations with that because it really shows the empathetic side of my son. And he is struggling with his own faith in this video. And I think a lot of people can identify with that. And then I made a change, and I decided that I would put that at the bottom, and I made a video based on all the knowledge that I had. And it's 56 seconds. And I put that on YouTube because I knew a lot of young people searched on YouTube. And then I put it also on the webpage. And then I started to get more response and comments. And I noticed that that page is always going to have what I would call a high bounce rate. And what that means is people go in the page, they see it's not going to give them directions, and they leave. What I'm trying to do is catch people at that point when they are a little less intense and a little bit more ambivalent, because we never know in that where we're going to catch people in that space. And then I had to put other links on the page that went to other information. What I noticed in the statistics that people do click on those suicide hotlines. And I noticed people were coming from India and Egypt and Kazakhstan and all these other countries, because it ranks number 6 in the world, not just the United States. So I had to put suicide hotlines are the one I knew, but I couldn't list 300 suicide hotlines. So I found a list off of Wikipedia that had the international suicide hotlines. I see that that's clicked on. I see that the suicide hotline. I see the crisis text line. So I can see in my statistics when people access those resources. They'll also, I put on the page when young adults go there, or really anybody, that says, how do I tell a parent I want to die? And that I wrote on the Mighty. And so I'll see people click through to that, because we tell people, reach out for help, but sadly we don't tell them what to say. What does that look like? And so I kind of have a script of, you need to say something like this. Because if we go in and we're struggling and we go to a parent and say, I'm thinking of hurting myself, I as a parent, I'm going to think, oh, he wants to drink too much. You know, I'm not going to think suicide. Everything in my mind is going to block that possibility out because I think I've done a reasonable job of parenting and that, you know, a child of mine ain't going to follow through with this. So I see that clicked often. So some people come in, they all of a sudden they want to know everything about Charles. So I've kind of linked to a lot of stuff about him, and it follows kind of a path because I had to recognize that people in suicidal ideation are in that, or suicide intensity,
Nice.
have to, they're just in that one tunnel vision place, and that I need to lead them. And if I can put enough time between their thoughts and their actions, I have a better chance of saving their life.
Yeah. So you have found a really innovative and unprecedented, as far as I'm concerned, way of capturing this very intense group that is, you know, maybe on the verge of practicing or learning more or taking action. And you bring them into this vortex of a journey where now they're looking at videos and they're checking out resources. And as they're doing that, they're getting different narratives. They're getting different ideas about maybe I can survive this, and time is passing. And one of the things we know so true to be about what, and I smiled when you said it, suicide intensity, this preferred term that's emerging that really is a better descriptor for many people of these surges that they have, these ebbs and flows of this intense feeling and these intense thoughts. And when you have someone who's surging like that, going from 0 to 100 really quickly, and they're feeling this urgency to take action, one of the best things that we can do is just get them to pause and get them to just kind of ride it out or do an emotional reset so that they can bring that intensity down. So your strategy has a number of different levels for people, and it's probably capturing people who are not being accessed by other forms of support or outreach. So it's really quite a brilliant move that you have. Tell us a little bit about kind of the metrics and some of the science, the research that you've done about your impact, and also like lessons learned. So people who are wondering how they can have the biggest impact here can also, I got a couple of the things out, like what are people searching? Use those phrases in your headline. Also, another tip that you have illuminated so far is be intentional of where you place your content based on the audience that you want to be reaching. So YouTube is for young people, LinkedIn is for working age people. Where do you place your content, and then how do you maximize, again, that SEO opportunity to connect with people who are searching? Any great research or science you can share with us around that?
So I like to go in and look at the statistics for that page. And one of the interesting things that I've started to decode is a lot of people will have one day where they'll have several episodes of that intensity. So I'll see them log in at 10 a.m. and they log in not just from their home and their phone, but I see company ISPs on these logins. And they'll log in again 2 or 3 hours later. They'll log in again 3 or 4 hours later.
So
And then again. And then it's sometimes I'll see that they'll then go to 4 or 5 pages, and sometimes they spend hours on the site. So I really would love to interview people, but of course I don't have that opportunity. And then with young people, sometimes it's more an impulsive thing. And as soon as they hear from somebody and they have a conversation, they feel in a better place. And then it's just utterly fascinating what different people do. And I see that what I perceive, like when it comes from a college, they'll often just look at stuff about Charles.
mm-hmm.
When it comes from a company, what I often see is that's when I see the suicide resources being accessed directly.
Interesting.
especially the text line, because I'm assuming that if you're in a cubicle situation,
Yep.
you can't be on the suicide hotline,
Oh
because
my gosh,
everybody's
this makes
being
total sense. Yeah.
um, there is, so I mentioned that bounce rate, but that bounce rate can be a person going in there 5 times, and then the sixth time they look it up, it sort of sticks.
I mean, that whole journey right there is fascinating to me. Because usually when you bounce out of a website, you're done.
Right.
It wasn't relevant, or you didn't find what you needed, and you're done in like 5 seconds. So to see this group come back again and again, it's like they're testing out hope. You
Exactly.
know?
They are. They're looking
Yeah.
for hope.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is they don't come back to that page from a direct link like they bookmark it. They go back to Google and search the same thing.
Oh, interesting.
And I believe that when you click on something in Google, it changes the color as long as you've left what's called a cookie. And that's just something that is saved for a couple of days. And I think they're looking through that list, and that one is red or purple and the rest of them aren't. And it highlights them. And because they're sort of in that tunnel vision mode, they click on it again. So they're not, what that tells me is they're not going to the places that are giving them directions.
Hmm.
Somewhere in their mind, they got some sense of hope there before, and they're going back because they want to find a reason to live.
Hmm.
And I think the majority of the people are looking for hope and a reason to live.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that until I started doing this. That didn't really hit me, but the number of people who are just like, I want so badly for somebody to listen. And when they make a comment, I answer. I've answered
Hmm.
thousands of comments because somebody just wants somebody to listen in that awful place. And I haven't always answered perfectly, but when you come from a place of compassion, that's more important than doing it perfectly. And
Absolutely.
I've got a lot of training, so now I'm better at that. But I've had a woman from England who was intensely suicidal for a long time. She did end up attempting and came back to let me know she was doing well. And she'll come back every 4 months and comment and just say, it's Debbie from England, and I'm still doing, well enough. And it's not great yet, but I'm really determined to make this work. And, I have a different attitude. Oh my gosh, I can't, that's what I live for. What can you
Yeah.
say?
Yeah. That's really, really reinforcing to get that kind of feedback, to know that you've made an impact. Um, as we like turn the corner here for this last piece of it, first of all, Ann Moss, you must get connected to some researchers and evaluators, because this data that you're on top of is absolutely phenomenal. And these findings that you have need to be published, so that other people can realize the power of what you've tapped into, and maybe we can replicate that in a number of places, so that we
That's what
can.
I'm hoping.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so yes, let's get you connected to some researchers.
Okay.
There's tons at an American Association of Suicidology that I'm sure would just like jump all over this project. So let's get that done. So we've covered a couple of the tips for the people out there that are coming to this podcast to really maximize their content in the digital space and connect with the audience they're most wanting to connect with. One of the things that I think is a huge downfall, myself included, is that the suicide prevention world is tiny, so tiny. The people who are actively engaged in it every day, in and out, and we are very insular. We just kind of talk to ourselves, and we tell everybody else they're doing stuff wrong and make people feel bad and all this stuff, and we're not effective in that space. So what are some tips you have on how we get our content in front of the people we really want it to be in front of, and get them to engage and then take action? Like what are some of your additional tips here?
I think if you want to get your content out there, you change the narrative around it and you find something else that people are concerned with
Mhm.
other than just using maybe the word suicide. Like, have you always thought things will never get better? Um, so people are thinking that, they're looking for that, and they want to connect with that. And then you can bring your research into that
Relate
space.
to that question. So how do you know what the questions are?
I think that that's the tough part. And that's what I used to do as a digital marketer, is that my client wanted to say, I have the best widget in the world. Well, you don't really care that it's the best widget in the world, and that's what everybody says. What's so special about this company? What do they offer? And it is pulling out that reason that they would find that content interesting. And that is not an easy thing to do. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I learned to do it and I do it now. And I know how to do it because I've done it for decades
Mm-hmm.
with advertising and marketing stuff. You know, I've got this much space to really sell this product and I got to do it in a great headline in 3 lines. How do I do that? How do I make that consumer interested? So it's never about just listing features and benefits, but understanding what in their head and their heart is going to draw them into that information. So I've started, even on my blog, doing a lot of more philosophical type posts. Like, you know, I hate when people say think positive.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I need you to just listen to my negative stuff
Mm-hmm.
before I can get to the positive stuff myself. I don't want my feelings invalidated. So I'll put things like that out there. And of course, the site's about suicide prevention, mental illness, addiction, grief, all the things people don't want to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm starting to experiment with that myself because we want to get in these big marketing conferences or women's conferences. And we're not going to get in there with headlines with, you know, that always have the word suicide in
You're
them.
so right. Yeah, absolutely. I think about my own content. The two pieces that I've put out, well, besides the TED Talk, the two other pieces that I put out that are have the most traction is what do you say when they say yes to the
Hmm.
suicide question? That got a ton of
That's
traction because people were afraid. What am I going to do if they tell me they are? So that answered a burning question for a lot of people. And the other one that got the most traction was top 10 apps for mental health, resilience, and suicide prevention. So I think
hmm
people were searching that, like, how do we know which ones are good, which ones are not, which ones are helpful, et cetera. So that actually continues to get a lot of traction, even though I published it like 2 years ago and a quarter of it's outdated. I really need to go back there and fix it. but you're really speaking to you gotta answer the burning questions that people are having and what they're searching if you're
You
going to
got it.
connect them online. Yep.
You got
Awesome.
it.
All right. Well, let me do a quick recap, and then I'll come back to you for any final thoughts, any things you want to leave our listeners with. Thank you so much, Ann Moss, for sharing your really intense and poignant story, your journey here. I know I can only hope that Charles is looking down at your work and is so proud of his mama for doing all of this. I know, because you are doing an amazing thing, and that his rap video out there is continuing his legacy of trying to help people sort through some really difficult times. I think that's just a beautiful piece of this. I also love that you bridged your talents and skills in marketing and digital technology in such a needed space here in suicide prevention. Um, and that you're doing it in such effective way. And so I want to just whatever I can do to connect you to the people who really legitimize this work that you're doing and get it out into other spaces so that people can realize like people are falling through the cracks and we have an opportunity to catch them like really
Exactly.
critical moment through technology and these tools that we have. So again, to summarize some of the tips that I heard, really be listening to what people's concerns are. and craft your content to answer those questions. You might want to be promoting certain things, but if you don't craft it to connect the dots, then you're just going to be speaking to yourself. This is a lesson
Exactly.
I learned over and over again. Number 2 tip that I heard from you is that if you are not in the space of suicide prevention as deeply as you and I are right now, it is really important to get yourself trained. There are a lot of people coming through acute suicide grief or worry about their friends, or companies now coming into the space of what do I do? Please don't just jump out and create a whole bunch of new content when you really don't know what you're talking about, because the chances of you actually doing unintended harmful things are possible. So get yourself trained, get Safe Talk, Assist, QPR, whatever it takes, so that you have more literacy in this space. And then the other piece that you do so beautifully is engagement. When you have an audience, let them know that you are there. And often they're going to have questions, need resources, want things to bounce off people, or just have a safe space to talk. So engaging with your people through social media content is probably the strongest thing that we can do to help build a community and get people connected in that space and time. So what are some final thoughts you have?
I think that my final thought is just listen. I think that we don't really connect with people like we should. We tend to want to lecture more and listen less, and we need to listen more and lecture less.
Absolutely.
We always want to fix. Most of us are not, we can't fix this for another human being. We can only help them understand that they are important by listening to them and by our actions. And I think as funny as and as talented as my son was, his greatest gift was letting other people know they mattered. And how he did that is he connected with them on an emotional level that not a lot of people are doing these days.
Yep.
And I
Yep.
think that is really important. And somebody who is deeply sensitive and is in that moment of suicidal intensity, they'll really know when you are connecting with them and that you really care.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. Listening is such an undervalued human capacity, right? It's just like, oh,
It
it's just
is.
listening. No, no, no. It is where people get deeply heart to heart connected when we listen well. So thank you so much for closing with that really important reminder. Again, thank you. Thank you to all the listeners that are here with us. Thanks to Dave, the sound editor, who's going to make us sound awesome. And Moss, if people want to find you, where should they go?
AnnMossRogers.com, EmotionallyNaked.com, and I wrote the book Diary of a Broken Mind, which is at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and a bunch of other places.
Super, super. So listeners, again, thanks for tuning in. If you want to get more of this, that we're going to have a boatload of show notes from this one, SallySpencerThomas.com, and go to the podcast, hit the show notes. We'll also be on all the places that podcasts are, but if you want the in-depth show notes, go there. Please sign up for the newsletter so you can see upcoming webinars, blogs, Twitter chats, etc., things that are happening. If you're really excited about these kinds of topics, and connect with me and let me know what more you want to hear. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, I'm in all the places, and I'd really love to hear what you think. So in closing, open your heart, challenge your thinking, and take action to save lives. Together, we can restore dignity and sustain a passion for living.